Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes cannot, and love finds beauty where others see only flaws. In Cedar Ridge, Montana, Thomas Whitmore learned this truth when he married Eleanor, a woman from the high mountains. The whole town mocked his choice. She was too wild, they said, too rough for a wealthy rancher like him. But Thomas knew better. Elena had strength that came from surviving in those harsh peaks, and wisdom that couldn't be bought with all his money. She also carried secrets from her past that would soon save their entire town from danger. The people who laughed at their marriage had no idea what kind of woman Elena really was. Would they learn her true worth before it was too late? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore ranch as Thomas stood on his porch, watching the cattle graze in the distance. At 35, he was the wealthiest man in Cedar Ridge, Montana, owner of 3,000 acres of prime grazing land and a herd that numbered in the hundreds. His father's ranch deed, yellowed with age and bearing the territorial seal of 1862, hung framed in his study, a constant reminder of the legacy he'd inherited and the expectations that came with it. Cedar Ridge had grown from a handful of buildings into a proper frontier town, complete with a main street lined with businesses, a church with a bell tower that chimed every hour, and enough respectable families to fill the pews on Sunday mornings. The railroad had reached them just 5 years prior, bringing with it an influx of settlers, merchants, and the kind of progress that made folks feel civilized, despite being hundreds of miles from any real city. Thomas had everything a man could want by frontier standards. His ranch house was the finest for 50 miles in any direction, built from lumber hauled in specially from Oregon, with glass windows that caught the light just so, and a wraparound porch where he could sit in the evenings and survey all he owned. His cattle operation was profitable, his standing in the community unquestioned, and his future seemed as secure as the mountains that ringed their valley. He should have been content. Most days, he told himself he was, but contentment, he'd learned, was a poor substitute for the kind of happiness that reached deep into a man's bones. That happiness had found him in the most unexpected place and form, a woman named Eleanor who'd appeared in Cedar Ridge 6 months ago, like morning mist rolling down from the high peaks. She'd arrived on foot, leading a pack mule loaded with furs and dried meat to trade, her dark hair braided simply and her clothes practical rather than pretty. While other women in town wore bustles and bonnets, Elena wore leather pants mended, with careful stitches and boots that had clearly walked countless mountain miles. The first time Thomas saw her, she'd been standing in Henderson's general store, negotiating the price of her furs with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. Her voice was soft but firm, and when old Pete Henderson tried to lowball her on the prime beaver pelts, she simply picked up her goods and started to leave. Henderson called her back, agreeing to her price, and Thomas watched the entire exchange. With growing fascination, Elena was beautiful, but not in the delicate way that most men in Cedar Ridge preferred their women. Her beauty was like the mountains themselves, rugged, enduring, and somehow both peaceful and dangerous at the same time. Her skin bore the golden touch of sun and wind. Her hands were strong from years of working with them, and her storm-grey eyes seemed to see everything while revealing nothing of her own thoughts. The townspeople had formed their opinions of her. Quickly, Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife, who appointed herself the arbiter of proper society, declared Elena unsuitable for civilized company. The other ladies whispered that she was too independent, too comfortable in the wilderness, too different from what a woman should be. "She's wild," they said, as if wildness were something shameful rather than the very quality that had allowed her to survive and thrive in country that would break most people. She doesn't know her place. But Thomas had seen something else in Elena from the beginning. He'd seen the careful way she examined everything before speaking, the respect she showed for elders even when they showed her none in return, and the quiet kindness she extended to children and animals. He'd watched her help Mrs. Chen, the elderly Chinese woman who ran the laundry, carry heavy baskets without being asked. He'd seen her share her jerky with stray dogs and leave wildflowers on the grave of a child she'd never known. Their courtship had been unconventional by Cedar Ridge standards. While other suitors brought flowers and candy, Thomas brought practical gifts: good coffee, warm wool, books for the long winter evenings. Elena, in turn, shared her knowledge of the mountains, pointing out weather signs in the clouds and teaching him which plants could heal and which could harm. They would ride together in the foothills, Elena on her sturdy mountain pony and Thomas on his thoroughbred mare, and she would show him places he'd never seen despite living in the valley his entire life. Hidden meadows where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, streams so clear you could count the stones on the bottom, and vantage points that offered views of the entire territory spread out below like a patchwork quilt. The mountains teach you patience, Elena had told him one evening as they watched the sunset paint the peaks gold and crimson. They teach you to see what's really there, instead of what you wish was there. They don't lie to make you feel better. It was during those quiet hours together that Thomas came to understand the depth of Elena's character. She had a way of listening that made him feel truly heard for the first time in years. When he spoke of the pressures of running the ranch, the loneliness of carrying his father's legacy alone, or his fears about the changing times, Elena didn't offer empty reassurances or rush to solve his problems. She simply listened, asked thoughtful questions, and occasionally shared insights that helped him see his challenges from new angles. Elena, for her part, spoke little of her past. Thomas learned that she'd been raised by her father in the high country, that she'd lost him some years back, and that she preferred the company of mountains to most people. She knew every trail, every pass, and every hidden valley for 100 miles in any direction. She could track animals by signs so faint that Thomas couldn't even see them, predict weather changes by the behavior of birds, and find food and shelter in places that looked utterly barren to his untrained eyes. But there were gaps in her story, moments when her eyes would grow distant and her voice would carry a weight that spoke of experiences she wasn't ready to share. Thomas didn't press. He'd learned that some stories emerged only when the teller was ready, and rushing them was like trying to hurry the seasons. The proposal had happened naturally, without grand gestures or elaborate planning. They'd been sitting by a creek in early spring, watching the water run high with snowmelt, when Eleanor had remarked that the sound reminded her of home. "This could be your home," Thomas had said quietly, "if you wanted it to be." Elena had studied his face for a long moment, and in her eyes he'd seen something he recognized as hope, mixed with wariness, like a wild creature deciding whether to trust. "The people in town," she'd begun, "will learn to see what I see," Thomas had finished, "and if they don't, that's their loss, not ours." Elena's simple silver ring, crafted by the town's blacksmith from metal she'd brought down from the mountains, had caused quite a stir when she'd first worn it into town. The ladies clucked their tongues over its lack of ornamentation. But Thomas found its clean lines and honest craftsmanship perfect for Elena's character. Their wedding had been a small affair, held in the church, despite Pastor Morrison's initial reluctance to perform the ceremony. Elena had worn a simple dress of deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, and Thomas had never seen anyone more beautiful. The reception afterward had been tense, with most of the town's prominent families attending out of obligation rather than joy. Mrs. Pemberton had made her disapproval clear by seating Elena at the furthest possible point from the head table and spending the evening making pointed comments about proper breeding and the importance of suitable matches. Other ladies had followed her lead, treating Elena with the kind of polite coldness that was somehow worse than outright hostility. The men had been little better. While they didn't snub Elena outright, they made it clear they considered Thomas's choice puzzling at best and foolish at worst. "She's pretty enough," he'd overheard Jake Morrison saying to his brother, "but what's a man of Thomas's standing doing with a mountain woman? Could have had his pick of proper ladies." Only a few people had shown genuine warmth toward the new Mrs. Whitmore. Doc Peterson, who delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge and buried many of their grandparents, had danced with Elena and proclaimed her a woman of substance. Maria Santos, whose husband ran the livery stable, had embraced Elena and whispered something in Spanish that made Elena smile. The first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her all evening, but the majority of Cedar Ridge remained skeptical of their union. Thomas knew they expected the marriage to fail, expected Elena to prove too wild for domesticated life or too rough for refined society. They waited for signs of trouble, for evidence that Thomas had made the mistake they all believed he'd made. Now, 3 months after the wedding, those expectations hadn't changed much. Elena had settled into ranch life with an ease that surprised even Thomas. She'd taken over the kitchen garden with impressive results, coaxing vegetables from the soil that put Mrs. Henderson's prized produce to shame. She'd mended fences, helped with the cattle, and proven herself capable of any task the ranch required. Yet still the town watched and waited and whispered. Thomas knew Elena felt the weight of their scrutiny. He'd catch her sometimes, standing at the kitchen window with that distant look in her eyes, as if she were seeing not the familiar barnyard, but the untamed peaks of her childhood. During these moments, he wondered if he'd been selfish to ask her to trade her mountain freedom for the constraints of his civilized world. But then Elena would turn from the window, smile at him with genuine warmth, and ask about his day or share some small observation about the weather or the animals, and Thomas would know that whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together. He just hadn't expected those challenges to be quite so immediate or quite so dangerous as what was heading their way. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Jimmy Martinez came riding hard into the ranch yard, his horse lathered with sweat and his face pale beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Thomas was checking the gate latches on the north pasture when he heard the thundering hooves, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. Jimmy was one of his most reliable hands, a steady man who'd worked cattle for 15 years and wasn't given to panic or unnecessary urgency. "Mr. Whitmore," Jimmy called out, sliding down from his horse before it had fully stopped. "We got big trouble up in the high pastures. Found Pete Williams this morning. He's dead, sir. Shot twice in the back." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Pete Williams had been with the ranch for over a decade, a quiet man who knew cattle and minded his own business. "Where?" "Up by Willow Creek, near the summer grazing grounds. His horse came back to camp without him yesterday evening, but we figured maybe he'd been thrown and was walking back. Found him at first light." Jimmy's voice cracked slightly. "Whoever did it took his rifle and his ammunition, but left his wallet and his watch." "This wasn't robbery, Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor appeared on the porch, drawn by the commotion. She took one look at Jimmy's expression and came down the steps, her movements quick and sure. "What's happened?" Thomas filled her in quickly, watching as Elena's face grew increasingly grave. When he mentioned the location, he saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern deeper than the situation alone warranted. "Did you see tracks?" Elena asked Jimmy directly. "Yes, ma'am. At least 6 horses, maybe more. Shod horses, not Indian ponies. They came from the north and headed west into the rocks where the tracking gets impossible." Jimmy paused, then added, "Ma'am, there's something else. Found this caught on a bush near where they left the main trail." He pulled a piece of paper from his shirt pocket, or rather, what remained of a piece of paper. It was partially burned, the edges charred and crumbling, but enough remained to see that it had been a letter. The writing was mostly illegible, but Thomas could make out a few words: "Take the cattle," and "No witnesses," and most chilling of all, "Burn them out if..." Elena took the fragment with careful fingers, studying it closely. Her face had gone very still, and Thomas noticed that her hands, usually so steady, trembled almost imperceptibly as she held the burned paper. "This paper," she said quietly, "it's good quality, not the kind most drifters or common rustlers would carry." "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. Before Elena could answer, another rider appeared on the horizon. This time it was Sheriff Daniels, a portly man in his 50s who'd kept the peace in Cedar Ridge for nearly 2 decades. Behind him rode Doc Peterson and 2 other men Thomas recognized as members of the town council. Sheriff Daniels dismounted heavily and tipped his hat to Elena with the kind of perfunctory politeness that managed to be both respectful and dismissive. "Mrs. Whitmore, Thomas, I expect you've heard about Pete Williams by now." "Jimmy just told us," Thomas confirmed. "Any idea who might have done this?" "That's what we're here to discuss." The sheriff's expression was grim. "This isn't the first incident. Got word this morning from ranches to the north and east. The Patterson spread lost 2 men last week, and the Rodriguez family found their line shack burned out with no sign of their riders. Whatever's happening, it's bigger than just cattle rustling." Doc Peterson spoke up, his weathered face creased with worry. "The Patterson murders were professional work, according to the sheriff up in Millerville. Clean shots, no unnecessary violence, but thorough. These aren't desperate men looking for quick money. They're organized and they're methodical." Elena stepped forward, still holding the burned letter fragment. "May I see the other evidence from the Patterson ranch?" Sheriff Daniels looked uncomfortable. "Well now, Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter for law enforcement and—" "Sheriff," Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of authority that came from years of being the most powerful man in the valley. "My wife has knowledge of these mountains that could be valuable. If there's any chance she can help identify who's responsible, I think we should listen." The sheriff glanced between Thomas and Elena, clearly reluctant but unable to argue with Thomas's logic or authority. "I suppose there's no harm in showing you what we found." He produced a small leather pouch from his saddlebags. Inside were several items: a distinctive brass button with an eagle design, a piece of rope with an unusual braiding pattern, and another partially burned document. Elena examined each item carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each piece of evidence. When she reached the rope, Thomas saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "This braiding," she said, running her fingers along the rope's surface. "It's not common. I've seen it before, but not recently." She looked up at the sheriff. "How long do you estimate these men have been in the territory?" "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months. They're smart enough to move in small groups and avoid the main trails." Sheriff Daniels paused, then added with obvious reluctance, "Mrs. Whitmore, you said you'd seen that rope pattern before. Where?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Thomas could see her weighing her words carefully. "Years ago, when I was younger, my father pointed out such rope to me once, said it was used by men who rode together for a long time, men who took pride in their craft." She handed the rope back to the sheriff. "He said it was the mark of men who made killing their profession." The group fell silent at that pronouncement. Doc Peterson was the first to speak. "Professional killers? In our territory? But why? What could they possibly want with our cattle and ranches?" "Maybe it's not about the cattle," Elena said quietly. "Maybe the cattle are just a convenient cover for something else." Sheriff Daniels frowned. "What do you mean?" Elena gestured toward the mountains that surrounded their valley. "These peaks hide a dozen different routes to the railroad, to mining camps, to places where stolen goods or wanted men could disappear. If someone wanted to establish a base of operations for larger crimes, they'd need to control the territory first. They'd need to eliminate anyone who might recognize them or interfere with their movements." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're talking about more than rustling. You're talking about taking over the entire region." "It would make sense," Elena continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when tracking difficult prey, focused, analytical, and somehow detached from the emotion of the situation. Control the valley, control access to the mountains, eliminate the established ranchers and their hands, bring in your own people, and suddenly you have a perfect base for operations throughout the territory. Sheriff Daniels looked skeptical. That's a lot of speculation based on some rope and a burned letter. Maybe, Elena conceded. But I know these mountains, Sheriff. I know how someone would move through them if they wanted to stay hidden, and I know where they'd establish camps if they planned to stay for a while. She paused, then added with quiet certainty, and I know that whoever burned that letter didn't want anyone to read the rest of it. The sheriff studied Elena's face for a moment, and Thomas could see him reassessing his initial dismissal of her input. You really think you could track these men? I think I could find their camps, yes, but more importantly, I think I might be able to predict where they'll strike next. Elena looked directly at Thomas. If I'm right about their pattern, they're working systematically through the valley, eliminating resistance ranch by ranch. The Whitmore spread is the largest and most prosperous. We'd be a logical target. The words hung in the air, like a threat made manifest. Thomas felt a protective anger rise in his chest, but it was tempered by a growing respect for Elena's analytical mind. While the other men had been focusing on the immediate tragedy of Pete Williams's death, Elena had been seeing the larger pattern, the strategic implications that none of them had considered. Well, Sheriff Daniels said after a moment, I suppose we'd better start planning our defense. Thomas, I'll need to coordinate with you about protecting your ranch and your people. We should probably consider bringing some of the smaller ranchers' families into town for safety. Agreed, Thomas said. But I think we should also consider Elena's offer to help track these men. If she can find their camps or predict their movements, we might be able to turn the tables on them. The sheriff looked uncomfortable again. Thomas, I appreciate your confidence in your wife, but tracking dangerous criminals isn't work for a lady, no matter how well she knows the country. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated controlled frustration. Sheriff Daniels, she said with quiet politeness, I understand your concerns. But if these men are as dangerous as we believe, and if they're planning to target this ranch, then my knowledge of the mountains might be the difference between survival and disaster. Before the sheriff could respond, another horse appeared on the horizon, this one moving at a dead run. As it drew closer, Thomas recognized Miguel Santos, who worked for the Peterson Ranch 10 miles south. Miguel reined in his horse hard, the animal sliding to a stop in a shower of dust and gravel. Sheriff, Mr. Whitmore, they hit the Peterson place last night, burned the main house and the bunkhouse. Old man Peterson and his son are dead, and Mrs. Peterson and the girl are missing. The news hit the group like a physical blow. Thomas felt Elena move closer to his side. Her presence, both comforting and strengthening. That settles it, Thomas said grimly. Elena, I want you to start checking our defensive positions and escape routes. Sheriff, we need to send word to every ranch in the valley, and we need to do it today. As the men began discussing immediate security measures, Thomas noticed Elena studying the burned letter fragment again. Her brow furrowed in concentration. Something about that piece of paper bothered her more than she was letting on, and Thomas made a mental note to ask her about it when they were alone. What he didn't know was that Eleanor had recognized more than just the rope braiding. She'd recognized the handwriting on that letter, even in its burned and fragmented state. It was handwriting she'd seen before, in wanted posters her father had shown her years ago. Handwriting that belonged to a man she'd hoped never to encounter again. But now it seemed that her past had found her, and it was coming for everything she'd grown to love. That evening, after the sheriff and his men had departed to spread warnings, throughout the valley, Elena sat on the porch steps sharpening her hunting knife. The blade was a thing of beauty, 10 inches of perfectly balanced steel with a handle of carved mountain oak that had been worn smooth by years of use. Her father had given it to her on her 16th birthday, along with the solemn responsibility that came with carrying such a weapon. A knife is only as good as the person holding it, he'd told her. But in the right hands, it can mean the difference between living and dying in country like this. Thomas watched her work the whetstone along the blade's edge with practiced strokes. Each movement was precise, economical, and somehow both meditative and purposeful. He'd seen Elena perform this ritual dozens of times since their marriage, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like preparation for war. "You recognize something today?" he said quietly, settling down beside her on the steps. "When you were looking at that rope and the letter fragment, what aren't you telling me?" Elena continued sharpening the knife for several long strokes before answering. "My father taught me to read sign, not just animal tracks, but human sign. The way people move, the things they leave behind, the patterns they follow." She paused to test the blade's edge against her thumb, drawing a thin line of blood that she wiped away without concern. "Everything we saw today tells a story. And it's not a story I like." "What kind of story?" Elena set down the whetstone and looked out toward the mountains, their peaks barely visible in the gathering dusk. "These aren't ordinary criminals, Thomas. The rope braiding, the quality of that letter paper, the methodical way they're moving. Through the valley, this is the work of men with military experience, men who've planned campaigns before." Thomas felt a chill of understanding. "You think they're former soldiers? I think they're deserters, or men discharged for reasons the army didn't want to make public." Elena's voice carried the weight of old knowledge, as if she were drawing on lessons learned long ago. "My father encountered groups like this before, men who'd learned discipline and tactics in the service, but turned those skills to criminal purposes." She stood and walked to the porch railing, her knife gleaming in the lamplight. The pattern of their attacks, the way they're eliminating witnesses, the fact that they're working systematically through the valley. This isn't random violence. They're clearing territory for something bigger. Thomas joined her at the railing. "You sound like you know more about this than you're saying." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Thomas heard the weight of memories she hadn't shared. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable than usual. "When I was 17, a group like this came through the high country. They'd been raiding mining camps and settlements for months, always moving, always staying ahead of the law." She turned the knife in her hands, the blade catching and reflecting the lamplight. "My father was, well, he wasn't just a mountain guide. He had other responsibilities, other skills. We tracked that group for 3 weeks before we finally cornered them." "What happened? What had to happen," Elena said simply. "But not before they killed 6 good people and burned out 2 families who'd done nothing but try to build decent lives in difficult country." Thomas studied his wife's profile in the lamplight, seeing new depths in the woman he'd married. "You're a father, these other responsibilities. Elena, what exactly did he do in the mountains?" Before Elena could answer, they heard the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, and Thomas relaxed slightly when he recognized Jake Morrison and 2 of his ranch hands. Jake dismounted and approached the porch, his face grim in the lamplight. "Thomas, Mrs. Whitmore, sorry to bother you so late, but we've got problems." Jake removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Lost contact with our line. Riders this afternoon. Sent men to check the North Range and found signs of a struggle at the Crow Creek camp. No bodies, but blood on the ground and clear evidence that several men were taken." Elena stepped forward. "Taken alive. Looks that way. Whoever did it was careful not to kill them on the spot." Jake's expression was troubled. "Question is, why take prisoners? Dead men can't talk, but live ones can. They want information," Elena said immediately, "about ranchers' defenses, about how many men each operation employs, about the best routes through the valley." She looked at Thomas. "They're gathering intelligence for a larger operation." Jake nodded grimly. "That's what we figured too. Which is why I came to warn you. Your ranch is the biggest prize in the valley. If they're planning something major, you'd be the primary target." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He employed nearly 30 men between his ranch hands and seasonal workers, and many of them had families living on his land. The thought of them in danger because of his wealth and prominence made his stomach tighten. "What do you think we should do?" he asked Elena. Elena was already moving, heading into the house with purposeful strides. She returned a moment later with a hand-drawn map that Thomas had never seen before. Spreading it on the porch table, she lit an additional lamp to illuminate. The detailed sketch, the map, showed the entire valley and the surrounding mountains, but with a level of detail that far exceeded any official survey. Every trail, every water source, every defensible position was marked with careful precision. Notes in Elena's neat handwriting indicated seasonal conditions, alternative routes, and what appeared to be strategic observations about line of sight and cover. "I've been working on this since we married," Elena explained, tracing routes with her finger. "Partly out of habit, but partly because I wanted to understand how someone might approach this ranch if they meant harm." Jake leaned over the map, his eyebrows rising. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is remarkable. You've got details here that I've never seen on any map, and I've been ranching in this valley for 20 years. Elena pointed to several locations marked with small red X's. "These are the most likely camping spots for a group trying to stay hidden while observing the valley. Good water, defensible positions, multiple escape routes. If I were planning an attack on this ranch, I'd use one of these locations for my base camp." Thomas studied the map with growing amazement. "Eleanor, when did you have time to scout all of these positions?" "Early mornings, when you thought I was just riding for pleasure." Elena's expression was slightly apologetic. "Old habits from my father's teaching. He always said that a person should know the country around their home better than anyone else, because someday their life might depend on that knowledge." Jake straightened up, his expression showing new respect for Eleanor's capabilities. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you're right about these camping spots, we might be able to turn the tables on these raiders. Instead of waiting for them to attack, we could find their base and—" "And what?" Eleanor interrupted. "Attack a fortified position with ranch hands who've never been in a real fight. These men are professionals, Jake. They've chosen their ground carefully, and they'll be expecting pursuit." "Then what do you suggest?" Thomas asked. Elena studied the map for a moment, then pointed to a series of trails that wound through the mountains east of the valley. "We evacuate the non-essential personnel, families, older workers, anyone who can't fight. Get them to safety in town or beyond. Then we use our knowledge of the country to our advantage." "How?" "We make them come to us, but on ground of our choosing." Elena's finger traced a route from the suspected camping areas to the ranch. "There are 3 main approaches to this ranch that would allow a large group to move undetected. We can't defend all 3 effectively, but we can funnel them toward the approach we prefer by blocking the others." Jake looked skeptical. "Block mountain passes?" "Mrs. Whitmore, we're talking about moving tons of rock or cutting down acres of trees." Elena smiled for the first time that evening, and there was something in that smile that reminded Thomas of a predator contemplating its next move. "Not block, Jake. Just make more difficult and time-consuming. A few trees across a trail, some loose rocks in the right places, maybe a washed-out bridge or 2. Nothing that would stop determined men, but enough to encourage them to take the path of least resistance." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for his wife's tactical thinking. "And the path of least resistance leads where?" Elena pointed to a narrow canyon that approached the ranch from the north. "Here, Willow Canyon. It's the most direct route, offers good cover for an approaching force, and has several defensive advantages for anyone holding the high ground." "You want to fight them in the canyon?" Jake asked. "I want to choose the battlefield," Elena corrected. "If we're going to face these men, let's face them on ground that favors defenders over attackers." Thomas looked at the map, then at his wife, seeing her with new eyes. The woman he'd married for her beauty and gentle strength was revealing herself to be a natural strategist with an understanding of warfare that exceeded anything he'd expected. "Elena," he said quietly, "your father, What exactly did he teach you in those mountains? Elena folded the map carefully, her movements precise and deliberate. Everything he thought I'd need to survive, Thomas. Everything he hoped I'd never have to use. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw depths of experience and knowledge that she'd kept hidden throughout their courtship and marriage. I think, she said softly, it's time you learned the rest of my story. After Jake Morrison and his men departed with promises to spread word of Elena's defensive strategy, Thomas found himself alone with his wife in their kitchen. Elena had spread her hand-drawn map on the large wooden table, and by the light of 2 oil lamps, she began pointing out details that even Thomas, who'd lived in the valley his entire life, had never noticed. This trail here, she said, tracing a thin line that wound through what appeared to be impassable terrain, connects to the old mining road about 5 miles north. Most people think it's been washed out for years, but it's still passable if you know where to cross the creek. Thomas leaned closer, studying the intricate details of Eleanor's cartography. How do you know all this? Some of these trails aren't on any official map. Elena's finger paused on a section marked with several small symbols that looked like crosses. My father and I used these routes regularly. We knew every game trail, every water source, every place where a person could hide or take shelter. She looked up at him. Thomas, there's something about my father I haven't told you, something I should have shared before we married, but I was afraid it might change how you saw me. Thomas pulled up a chair beside her, close enough that he could see the careful detail in her map-making and the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her nervousness. Elena, nothing you tell me could change how I feel about you, but I need to understand what we're facing, and I need to understand why you seem to know so much about dealing with dangerous men. Elena was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the map. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of long-held secrets. My father's name was James Crawford. In the mountains, people called him a guide, and that was true as far as it went. But his real work was as a federal marshal. Thomas felt the pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. A marshal. It explains why we moved through the mountains the way we did. Why he taught me to track and shoot and read sign like a professional. Elena's voice grew softer. It explains why he knew so much about the kind of men who prey on isolated communities, and why he felt responsible for stopping them. She stood and walked to a trunk in the corner of the kitchen, returning with a leather portfolio that Thomas had seen before, but never examined closely. Elena opened it carefully, revealing documents, photographs, and what appeared to be official correspondence. Marshal James Crawford, appointed by the territorial government in 1867, she said, showing Thomas a commission document. For 15 years, he worked to keep the peace in country where regular law enforcement couldn't reach. Thomas studied the documents, seeing his wife's story in a completely new light. Elena, this changes everything. If your father was a federal marshal, then you have legal standing to what? Elena interrupted gently. My father is dead, Thomas. Has been for 3 years now. His authority died with him, and I have no official standing with any law enforcement agency. She paused, then added with quiet emphasis, but I do have his knowledge, his training, and his records. She pulled out a thick folder filled with wanted posters, incident reports, and detailed descriptions of various criminal groups that had operated in the territory over the years. These men who are attacking the valley, they're not strangers. To me, Thomas, at least their methods aren't. I've seen their work before. Thomas felt a chill of understanding. The group that came through the high country when you were 17 was part of a larger organization that my father had been tracking for 2 years. Elena's expression grew grim. We broke up that particular group, but the leaders escaped. My father always believed they'd regroup and try again, somewhere else, with new recruits and better planning. She pulled out a specific wanted poster, yellowed with age, but still legible. The drawing showed a hard-faced man with distinctive scars along his jawline. Benjamin Caulfield, former army captain, dishonorably discharged for stealing military supplies and selling them to civilian contractors. My father suspected he was the one organizing these raids, but we could never prove it. Thomas studied the drawing. You think this Caulfield is leading the group that's attacking our valley? I think it's possible. The tactical approach, the systematic elimination of resistance, the fact that they're taking prisoners for information, all of that fits Caulfield's methods. Eleanor returned the poster to the folder. But whether it's him or someone like him, the important thing is that these aren't ordinary criminals. They're organized, disciplined, and they have a long-term plan. Thomas absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility settling heavier on his shoulders. Eleanor, if you're right, if these are the same men who killed your father— My father wasn't killed by these men, Elena said quietly. He died in an avalanche while pursuing horse thieves in the high peaks. It was quick and clean, the kind of death he would have chosen if he'd had a choice. She paused, then added with a slight smile, He used to say that the mountains would claim him eventually, and he was right. Relief and sadness warred in Thomas's chest. Relief that Elena hadn't suffered the trauma of losing her father to violence, and sadness for the lonely years she must have endured after his death. But these records, Eleanor continued, tapping the folder, contain everything my father learned about criminal organizations in the territory, their methods, their preferred targets, their weaknesses. If we're going to defend this valley effectively, this information could be invaluable. Thomas reached across the table and took Elena's hand. Why didn't you tell me this before? About your father, about your knowledge of law enforcement. Elena's fingers intertwined with his. Because I wanted to be just Elena, the woman you fell in love with, not Marshall Crawford's daughter, not someone defined by her father's profession or her unusual upbringing. She looked directly into his eyes. I wanted to be your wife, not your tactical advisor. You're both, Thomas said firmly, and right now, I need both. This valley needs both. Elena squeezed his hand, then turned back to the map. Then let's plan our defense properly. Based on what I know about groups like this, they'll want to strike quickly once they've gathered their intelligence. They won't want to give us time to organize or call for outside help. How long do you think we have? Elena considered the question carefully. If they took Jake's men today for questioning, they'll need at least a day to extract useful information and plan their attack. But they won't wait much longer than that. Captured men are a liability, and keeping prisoners increases the risk of discovery. Thomas felt a surge of urgency. 2 days, maybe 3, at most, which means we need to start evacuating non-combatants tomorrow morning and begin implementing our defensive strategy immediately. Eleanor pointed to several locations on her map. We'll need teams here, here, and here to create the obstacles I mentioned. Nothing too elaborate, just enough to channel their approach toward Willow Canyon. And once they're in the canyon, Elena's expression grew thoughtful. That depends on how many men they have and how well armed they are. But the canyon offers several advantages for defenders: high ground, limited approach routes, and natural cover. If we position our people correctly, we should be able to hold off a much larger force. Thomas studied his wife's face in the lamplight, seeing the confidence of someone who'd been trained by a professional and tested by real experience. Elena, I have to ask, have you ever actually been in a gunfight? Elena was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Twice. Once when I was 19 and helped my father apprehend a group of claim jumpers, and once about a year before he died, when we encountered desperados who'd killed a family of settlers. She met his eyes. I'm not a killer by nature, Thomas, but I can do what needs to be done to protect innocent people. The simple honesty of her statement, delivered without bravado or false modesty, convinced Thomas more than any boasting could have. His wife was not only capable of defending their home, she was probably their best chance of survival. All right, he said, standing and moving to the gun cabinet in the corner of the room. Tell me what we need to do. Eleanor rose and joined. him at the cabinet, her movements sure and purposeful. First, we need to inventory our weapons and ammunition. Then we need to identify our best shooters among the ranch hands. Finally, we need to get word to the other ranches about coordinating our defense. Thomas unlocked the cabinet, revealing a collection of rifles and handguns that he'd accumulated over the years. Elena examined each weapon with the practiced eye of someone who understood their capabilities and limitations. "Good rifles," she commented, checking the action on a Winchester. "But we'll need more ammunition than you have here, and we should consider setting up a supply cache in the canyon, in case we need to hold position for an extended period." As Elena continued her assessment of their defensive capabilities, Thomas found himself marveling at the transformation in his wife. The gentle, quiet woman who'd won his heart was still there, but now he could see the steel beneath the softness, the trained competence beneath the mountain-bred wisdom. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of preparation and the difficult task of convincing his ranch hands to trust their lives to the strategic insights of a woman most of them barely knew. But tonight, for the first time since hearing about Pete Williams's death, Thomas felt something like hope. Elena knew what they were facing. More importantly, she knew how to fight it. Dawn came grey and cold, with low clouds clinging to the mountain peaks like smoke from distant fires. Thomas stood on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching as Eleanor organized the evacuation of non-essential personnel with the efficiency of someone who'd done such things before. Women and children, older ranch hands, and anyone not capable of fighting were being loaded into wagons for the journey to Cedar Ridge. Maria Santos approached Elena with her 3 young children in tow, her face creased with worry. "Mrs. Whitmore, my husband wants to stay and fight, but I'm frightened for the little ones." Eleanor knelt down to the children's level, her voice gentle but reassuring. "Your papa is a brave man, and he's going to help keep everyone safe. But you and your mama are going to town, where there are lots of people to look after you. Can you be brave like your papa and help your mama take care of your little brother?" The oldest child, a boy of perhaps 7, nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am, I'll protect them." Elena smiled and ruffled his hair. "I know you will. That's what good men do. They protect the people they love." Thomas watched this interaction with a growing sense of pride and amazement. Elena had a natural way with children that spoke to her capacity for gentleness, even in the face of approaching violence. It was yet another layer to the complex woman he'd married. Doc Peterson emerged from the ranch house where he'd been examining the ranch hands who'd volunteered to stay and fight. At 62, the doctor was too old for combat, but insisted on remaining to treat any wounded. His assessment was both encouraging and sobering. "You've got 23 men willing to fight," he reported to Thomas and Elena. 15 of them are good shots, and most have at least some experience with violence. Bar fights, dealing with rustlers, that sort of thing. But none of them have been in anything like a real battle. Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Experience with violence is better than no experience at all. Fear of getting hurt can make men hesitant, but these men know that pain and danger are survivable." She paused. "What we need to worry about is panic. When the shooting starts in earnest, some men freeze and others run. We need to position our people so that the steadiest hands are in the most critical spots." "Who would you consider our steadiest hands?" Thomas asked. Elena had clearly been thinking about this already. "Miguel Santos. He's calm under pressure and thinks before he acts. Jimmy Martinez has good instincts and doesn't rattle easily. Your foreman, Bill Tucker, has natural leadership and the men respect him." She paused. "And surprisingly young Danny Morrison. He's only 19, but he has the kind of quiet confidence that often translates to steadiness under fire." Thomas was impressed by Elena's assessment of his men. She'd been observing them carefully during the months since their marriage, noting qualities that even he had missed. "Where do you want to position them?" Elena walked to the porch railing and pointed toward the mouth of Willow Canyon, barely visible in the distance. Bill Tucker and half the men will be on the north rim of the canyon, where they can fire down on anyone entering from that approach. Miguel and Jimmy will anchor the south rim with another group. Danny and the remaining men will be held in reserve, positioned where they can reinforce either side if needed. And us? Thomas asked. Elena's expression grew serious. You'll be with the reserve group, where you can coordinate the overall defense and make tactical decisions as the situation develops. She paused. I'll be forward, scouting their approach and providing early warning. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Elena, absolutely not. I won't have you out there alone, exposed to... Thomas. Elena's voice was firm, but not unkind. This is what I'm trained for. My father spent years teaching me to move through these mountains without being seen, to observe without being observed. I can get close enough to count their numbers and assess their weapons without putting myself in unnecessary danger. But if something goes wrong... Elena reached into her shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch that Thomas recognized, but had never examined closely. She opened it carefully, revealing an assortment of dried plants, roots, and what appeared to be small glass vials. This is my father's medicine kit, she explained, but it's more than that. These aren't just healing herbs. Some of them can be used to create distractions, to mask scent, even to temporarily disable enemies if necessary. She showed him a particular root. This, mixed with water, creates a smoke that causes severe coughing and temporary blindness. This one, she indicated. A different plant can be used to drug water or food, causing deep sleep within minutes. Thomas stared at the collection with new understanding. Your father taught you more than tracking and shooting. He taught me everything a law enforcement officer needs to know to survive in hostile territory. Elena returned the pouch to its place beneath her shirt, including how to gather intelligence without engaging in direct confrontation. Doc Peterson, who had been listening to this exchange, spoke up with obvious admiration. Mrs. Whitmore, your father sounds like a remarkable man. The territory could use more lawmen with his knowledge and dedication. Elena's expression grew distant for a moment, and Thomas caught a glimpse of the grief she still carried for her father's loss. When she spoke, her voice was soft with memory. He used to say that the law wasn't about the badge or the authority. It was about standing between good people and those who would do them harm. He said that anyone could carry a gun, but not everyone had the stomach to use it in defense of others when the moment came. And you? Thomas asked quietly. Do you have that stomach? Elena met his eyes directly. I hope I never have to find out. But if these men threaten innocent people, if they threaten you or the families who depend on this ranch for their livelihood, then yes, I'll do whatever is necessary. The simple conviction in her voice convinced Thomas more than any dramatic declaration could have. His wife was not eager for violence, but she was prepared for it, and that preparation might be the difference between survival and disaster. A shout from the main road interrupted their conversation. Sheriff Daniels was approaching at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim. Behind him rode two men Thomas didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of practical clothing that suggested they'd spent considerable time in the saddle. The sheriff dismounted quickly and approached the porch. Thomas, Mrs. Whitmore, we've got developments you need to know about. He gestured to the two men with him. This is Marshal Tom Bradley from the territorial capital and Deputy U.S. Marshal James Quinn. Thomas felt a surge of relief. Federal law enforcement meant resources and authority that the local sheriff couldn't provide. But Elena's reaction surprised him. Instead of relief, he saw wariness in her expression. Marshal Bradley stepped forward, a lean man in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. Mr. Whitmore, we've been tracking a criminal organization through several territories for the past 6 months. We have reason to believe they're the group responsible for the attacks in your valley. What kind of organization? Elena asked, her voice carefully neutral. Deputy Marshal Quinn answered, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. Former military personnel, led by a man named Benjamin Caulfield. They've been conducting what amounts to military-style raids on isolated communities, stealing livestock and supplies, but more importantly, they've been recruiting. Elena's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw her hands tighten almost imperceptibly. Recruiting for what purpose? We believe Caulfield is building a private army, Marshal Bradley explained. The ultimate goal appears to be taking control of strategic territory and establishing what amounts to a criminal kingdom beyond the reach of federal law. Thomas felt the scope of the threat expanding in his mind. You're talking about more than just cattle rustling. Much more. Caulfield and his organization represent a threat to the entire territorial system. They're well-armed, well-organized, and they've already driven federal law enforcement out of 2 counties to the south. Marshal Bradley's expression was grim. We can't allow them to establish a foothold here. Elena stepped forward slightly. Marshal Bradley, what do you know about Benjamin Caulfield's background, his military service, his methods of operation? The marshal studied Elena with new interest. Ma'am, you seem to know something about military tactics yourself. Are you familiar with Caulfield's reputation? Eleanor hesitated for a moment, and Thomas could see her weighing how much to reveal. My father was a federal marshal, James Crawford. He tracked groups like this for years, and he believed that Benjamin Caulfield was responsible for organizing several raid groups throughout the territory. Both federal marshals straightened with obvious recognition. James Crawford was your father? Marshal Bradley asked. Ma'am, your father was a legend in federal law enforcement. His reports on criminal organizations in the Mountain Territories were considered essential reading for any marshal working this region. Deputy Quinn nodded emphatically. Marshal Crawford's intelligence work probably saved hundreds of lives over the years. His understanding of how these criminal groups operated was unmatched. Elena's expression softened slightly at this recognition of her father's work, but she remained focused on the immediate threat. Then you understand that we're not dealing with ordinary criminals. Caulfield's men will be disciplined, well-armed, and they'll follow a specific tactical plan, which is why we need to coordinate our response carefully, Marshal Bradley said. We have a detachment of federal agents positioned about 20 miles south, but they won't reach this valley for at least 2 days. In the meantime, we need to hold off any attack and gather intelligence about Caulfield's current strength and intentions. Thomas felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders. Gentlemen, my wife has already developed a defensive strategy based on her knowledge of the terrain and Caulfield's likely methods. Perhaps you should hear her assessment. Elena looked surprised at Thomas's confidence in her abilities, but she stepped forward and began outlining her defensive plan with calm authority. As she spoke, Thomas watched the 2 federal marshals' expressions change from polite attention to genuine respect. Mrs. Whitmore, Marshal Bradley said when Elena finished, your tactical assessment is remarkably sophisticated. Have you had formal military training? No, sir. But my father believed that law enforcement in frontier territory required the same skills as military scouting and reconnaissance. He taught me accordingly. Deputy Quinn looked thoughtful. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to suggest a modification to your plan. If we could capture 1 or 2 of Caulfield's men alive, the intelligence value would be enormous. We've been trying to locate his main base of operations for months. Eleanor nodded slowly. It's possible, but it would require taking additional risks. We'd need to position capture teams outside the main defensive perimeter. I'll volunteer for that, Thomas said immediately. No, Eleanor said firmly. If we're going to attempt captures, it needs to be done by people with the right skills and experience. People who can move quietly and strike quickly without alerting the main force. Marshal Bradley studied Elena's face carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, are you volunteering for that assignment? Elena was quiet for a moment, and Thomas could see her weighing the risks against the potential benefits. When she spoke, her voice was steady and determined. Yes, sir, I am. The argument that followed Elena's volunteer statement was brief but intense. Thomas insisted that he wouldn't allow his wife to put herself in such danger, while the federal marshals pointed out that her unique combination of skills and local knowledge made her the logical choice for the reconnaissance mission. Elena herself remained calm throughout the discussion, occasionally offering practical observations that highlighted both the risks and the necessity of gathering intelligence about Caulfield's forces. The debate was settled when Elena quietly opened her medicine pouch and began explaining the contents in detail. As she described each herb's properties, which could induce sleep, which could create temporary blindness, which could mask human scent from tracking dogs, both marshals realized that she possessed knowledge and tools that no one else in their group could match. "Very well," Marshal Bradley finally conceded, "but you won't go alone. Deputy Quinn has experience in reconnaissance, and he'll accompany you." Elena nodded her acceptance, then turned to Thomas. "We need to discuss the timing. If Caulfield's men took prisoners yesterday for questioning, they'll want to move quickly. My guess is they'll attack either tonight or early tomorrow morning." Thomas felt his chest tighten at the thought of Elena venturing into hostile territory. But he could see the logic of her plan. "What do you need from me?" "Complete the defensive preparations we discussed. Position the men as we planned, but keep them hidden until the attack begins. And Thomas," Elena's voice softened, "trust the plan. Even if things seem to be going badly at first, trust that everything we've set up is designed to funnel them into our strongest defensive position." Doc Peterson, who had been quietly listening to the tactical discussion, stepped forward with a leather satchel. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've prepared medical supplies for treating gunshot wounds and other injuries, but I want you to take this as well." He handed Elena a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. "Laudanum, highly concentrated. A few drops will cause unconsciousness within minutes, and it's nearly tasteless when mixed with water or whiskey." Elena accepted the vial with a nod of thanks. For prisoners, or for yourself if you're captured and need to escape." Doc Peterson's expression was grave. "I've heard enough stories about Benjamin Caulfield to know that being taken alive by his men would not be pleasant, especially for a woman." The sobering reality of Elena's mission settled over the group like a cold wind. Thomas reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it gently. "Elena, promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back." Elena's fingers intertwined with his, and for a moment her composed mask slipped, revealing the woman beneath the tactical expert. "I promise I'll do everything I can to come back to you, Thomas, but more than that, I promise I'll do everything necessary to protect this valley and the people in it." Deputy Quinn stepped forward, checking his weapons and equipment. "Mrs. Whitmore, when do you want to leave?" Elena looked at the sky, assessing the light and weather conditions. 1 hour before sunset, that will give us time to reach the observation positions while there's still enough light to see, but we'll have darkness for concealment during the actual reconnaissance. The next few hours passed in a blur of final preparations. Elena changed into dark clothing suitable for moving through brush and rocks without making noise. She secured her father's hunting knife at her belt, along with the medicine pouch and the vial Doc Peterson had provided. Her movements were economical and purposeful, like someone preparing for a job she'd done before. Thomas found himself watching Elena's preparations with a mixture of pride and terror. The woman he'd married for her gentle beauty was transforming before his eyes into something he'd never expected, a warrior preparing for battle. "Thomas," Elena said as she checked the loads in her pistol, "there's something else you need to know. If this goes badly, if Caulfield's forces are larger than we expect, or if our defensive position is overrun, you need to be prepared to retreat. I won't abandon the ranch. You won't be abandoning it. You'll be preserving the lives of good men so they can fight another day." Elena's voice was firm, but not unkind. "My father always said that tactical retreats aren't defeats, they're investments in future victories." She pulled out her hand-drawn map one more time, pointing to a series of routes that led away from the ranch toward the deeper mountains. These trails will take you and the men to defensible positions where you can hold out until federal reinforcements arrive. The routes are marked clearly enough that anyone can follow them, even in darkness. Thomas studied the escape routes, impressed once again by Elena's thorough preparation. "You've thought of everything. I've tried to. But battles rarely go according to plan, which is why it's important to have multiple options." Elena folded the map and handed it to him. "Keep this with you. And Thomas, if I don't come back from the reconnaissance, don't wait for me. Begin." The defensive preparations immediately. The finality in her voice made Thomas's throat tighten. "Elena," she silenced him with a gentle kiss, her lips soft against his, but her body tense with preparation for what lay ahead. "I love you, Thomas Whitmore. Whatever happens tonight, remember that you gave me something I never expected to have, a home worth fighting for." Before Thomas could respond, Deputy Quinn appeared with their horses ready. Elena mounted her sturdy mountain pony with fluid grace, checking her equipment one final time. In the fading light of afternoon, she looked like something from an old legend, a mountain spirit preparing to defend her territory against invaders. "We'll signal you when we're returning," Elena called down to Thomas. 3 owl calls, repeated. Twice. Any other signal means trouble. Thomas watched his wife and the deputy marshal ride toward the mountains, their figures growing smaller until they disappeared among the rocks and shadows. Then he turned to the grim business of preparing for battle, knowing that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of his ranch, but the future of everyone he cared about. As darkness settled over the valley, Thomas positioned his men according to Elena's tactical plan. Bill Tucker and his group took their positions on the north rim of Willow Canyon, while Miguel Santos led another team to the south rim. Danny Morrison and the reserve force established themselves at the canyon's mouth, where they could provide support wherever it was needed most. The waiting began. Thomas found himself listening for sounds from the mountains, straining to hear any indication of Elena's progress or safety. The night was clear and cold, with enough moonlight to see movement, but not enough to provide detailed visibility. Perfect conditions for the kind of stealthy approach that Elena excelled at. Around midnight, Sheriff Daniels approached Thomas's position with a troubled expression. "Thomas, I've been thinking about what those federal marshals said, about Caulfield building a private army. If that's true, if he's really trying to take control of territory rather than just steal cattle, then this attack might be bigger than we're prepared for." Thomas nodded grimly. Elena considered that possibility. It's why she insisted on the reconnaissance. "We need to know what we're actually facing, and if it turns out to be more than we can handle." Thomas thought about Elena's escape routes, about her father's wisdom regarding tactical retreats. "Then we'll do what we have to do to preserve lives. But Sheriff, I want you to know, I'm not giving up this valley without a fight. Too many good people have worked too hard to build something decent here." Sheriff Daniels clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "I figured you'd say that. For what it's worth, I think your wife's plan gives us our best chance. She's got a mind for this kind of thing that I've never seen in a woman before." "She's remarkable," Thomas agreed. "I just hope I get the chance to tell her that again." In the distance, an owl called 3 times, paused, then called 3 times again. Elena's signal. Thomas felt his heart rate increase as he prepared to learn what his wife had discovered in the darkness beyond the valley. Elena and Deputy Quinn returned just after midnight, their faces grim in the lamplight of the ranch house. Elena carried something wrapped in cloth, which she set carefully on the kitchen table before speaking. "We found their main camp," she reported to the assembled group of Thomas, Marshal Bradley, Sheriff Daniels, and the senior ranch hands. 43 men, well-armed and organized into military-style units. They have sentries posted, regular patrol schedules, and enough supplies for an extended campaign. Marshal Bradley leaned forward. 43, that's nearly twice what we estimated. It gets worse, Deputy Quinn added. These aren't desperate men or casual criminals. They're disciplined, experienced fighters. Most of them appear to be former military, and they're following proper field protocols. Elena unwrapped the cloth bundle, revealing several items they'd managed to acquire during their reconnaissance. A cavalry sword with distinctive markings, military-issue ammunition, and most importantly, a leather portfolio filled with documents. We were able to get close enough to their command tent to overhear planning discussions. Eleanor continued. The attack is scheduled for dawn, coming from 3 directions simultaneously. But that's not the most important thing we learned. She opened the portfolio, spreading out several documents that made Marshal Bradley's eyes widen. Official military correspondence, supply requisitions, and what appeared to be territorial maps marked with strategic positions. These documents, Elena said quietly, show that Benjamin Caulfield isn't just building a criminal organization. He's planning to establish what amounts to an independent territory with himself as the military governor. Thomas felt the scope of the threat expanding in his mind. You're talking about secession. Not exactly secession, but something almost as dangerous. Elena pointed to one of the maps, which showed the entire mountain region with various locations marked in red. Caulfield's plan is to control all the mountain passes, all the mining operations, and all the major ranches in this part of the territory. Once he has that control, he can tax commerce, control trade routes, and essentially operate outside federal authority. Marshal Bradley studied the documents with growing alarm. This is treason. If Caulfield succeeds, it could inspire similar attempts throughout the frontier territories. Which is why, Eleanor said, reaching into the portfolio for one final document, the federal government has been secretly negotiating with him. The silence that followed Eleanor's statement was deafening. Thomas felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. What do you mean, negotiating? Elena handed a letter to Marshal Bradley, whose face went pale as he read. This is correspondence between Caulfield and someone in the territorial administration. They're offering him an official appointment as regional security chief in exchange for bringing his organization under government authority. Deputy Quinn's expression was stunned. They want to legitimize him. Give him official sanction for what he's been doing. It appears that certain elements in the territorial government believe it's easier to co-opt Caulfield than to fight him. Elena's voice carried a note of disgust. They're willing to overlook his crimes in exchange for his help in maintaining order in remote areas where regular law enforcement is difficult. Thomas felt anger building in his chest. And the people he's killed, the families he's destroyed, those are just acceptable losses? Elena reached into her shirt and pulled out something that made everyone in the room freeze. A tarnished silver badge bearing the distinctive star design of a federal marshal. This belonged to my father, Marshal James Crawford, appointed by President Grant himself to maintain federal law in the mountain territories. She set the badge on the table with ceremonial care. My father spent 15 years fighting men like Benjamin Caulfield. He died believing that the law meant something, that federal authority existed to protect innocent people from those who would prey on them. Her voice grew stronger. I will not allow his life's work to be undone by political convenience. Marshal Bradley stared at the badge, recognition dawning in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying... I'm saying that under territorial law, in the absence of appointed federal authority, and in the face of immediate threat to civilian populations, a federal marshal's immediate family members can assume temporary law enforcement powers. Eleanor's voice was calm but absolutely certain. It's an obscure provision, almost never used, but it exists. Thomas felt the room spinning as he realized what Eleanor was proposing. Eleanor, you can't seriously be considering... I'm not considering anything. Thomas, I'm stating a fact. Eleanor picked up her father's badge and pinned it to her shirt. As of this moment, I am acting as a federal marshal in this territory, and Benjamin Caulfield and his organization are under arrest for murder, treason, and crimes against the territorial government. The transformation in Elena was immediate and profound. The gentle mountain woman Thomas had married was still there, but now she stood with the authority of federal law behind her. Her posture was straighter, her voice carried more command, and her eyes held the steely resolve of someone who had accepted a duty larger than herself. Marshal Bradley found his voice first. "Mrs. Whitmore, even if what you're saying is legally valid, you can't possibly arrest 43 armed men with the resources we have available." Elena smiled, and there was something in that smile that reminded Thomas of her father's hunting knife. Beautiful, precisely made, and potentially deadly. "Marshal Bradley, I don't intend to arrest them in the conventional sense, but I do intend to ensure that they face justice for their crimes." She turned to address the entire group. "Gentlemen, everything changes now. This is no longer a matter of defending a ranch against cattle rustlers. This is a federal law enforcement operation against a treasonous organization that threatens the stability of the entire territory." Sheriff Daniels looked bewildered. "Mrs. Whitmore, what exactly are you proposing?" Eleanor walked to her hand-drawn map, spreading it out on the table. "I'm proposing that we use superior knowledge of the terrain, better tactical positioning, and the element of surprise to neutralize Caulfield's organization as an effective fighting force." She paused. "And then I'm proposing that we capture Benjamin Caulfield alive and transport him to the territorial capital to face federal charges." The audacity of Elena's plan left the room in stunned silence. Thomas looked at his wife, now acting federal marshal, and felt a mixture of pride, terror, and awe that such strength and determination could exist in one person. "Elena," he said quietly, "are you absolutely certain about this legal authority you're claiming?" Elena met his eyes directly. "My father made sure I understood every aspect of federal law enforcement in frontier territories. He said that someday the knowledge might be important, though I never imagined it would be under these circumstances." She paused. "Thomas, I know this isn't what you expected when you married me, but this badge, this responsibility, it's my inheritance, and it's my duty." Thomas looked at the silver star pinned to Elena's shirt, thinking about the quiet woman who'd won his heart with her gentle wisdom and mountain-bred strength. That woman was still there, but now he could see the steel that had always been beneath. The surface, the legacy of a man who dedicated his life to protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Eleanor's smile was warm but determined. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to help me finish what my father started. Benjamin Caulfield has spent years terrorizing innocent people throughout these territories. Tomorrow morning that ends." As if summoned by her words, the sound of distant gunfire echoed from the mountains, scattered shots that suggested Caulfield's men had discovered their missing documents. Eleanor listened for a moment, then nodded. Grimly, "They know we were there, which means they'll accelerate their timeline." She looked around the room. "Gentlemen, we have perhaps 3 hours before they attack. I suggest we use that time wisely." The woman, who had once been simply Thomas Whitmore's wife, began issuing orders with the calm authority of someone born to command. And Thomas realized that he was about to discover just how much strength and courage could be contained in one human heart. Elena spread her father's journal across the kitchen table, its leather-bound pages yellowed with age, but filled with meticulous handwriting that documented years of law enforcement experience in frontier territory. Thomas watched as she turned to a specific section, her finger tracing detailed notes about Benjamin Caulfield and his criminal organization. "My father tracked Caulfield for 2 years before he died," Elena explained to the assembled group. "Every raid, every known associate, every tactical weakness he observed." She pointed to a particular passage. "Caulfield's greatest strength is also his greatest weakness. He operates like a military commander, which makes his forces predictable to anyone who understands military thinking." Marshal Bradley leaned over the journal, reading the careful observations that Marshal Crawford had recorded. Your father was remarkably thorough. These notes contain intelligence that could have saved lives if they'd been widely shared. My father believed in keeping detailed records, Elena replied. He said that knowledge died with the man who possessed it, unless it was written down for others to use. She turned several pages, revealing tactical diagrams and battle plans. He developed specific strategies for confronting organized criminal groups like Caulfield's. Deputy Quinn studied one of the diagrams. This shows a three-pronged assault, being countered by a withdrawal to high ground, followed by a concentrated counterattack. Is this what you're planning? Elena nodded. With modifications based on our specific terrain and resources. Caulfield will expect us to defend the ranch buildings directly, which would play to his advantages in numbers and firepower. Instead, we're going to use the canyon to channel his forces into a killing ground, where our superior position and knowledge of the terrain will neutralize his numerical advantage. Thomas felt a mixture of admiration and dread as he watched Elena transform his ranch hands into a coordinated fighting force. She moved among the men with quiet authority, checking weapons, assigning positions, and explaining each person's role. In the overall plan, the men, many of whom had been skeptical of taking orders from a woman, found themselves responding to her competence and clear thinking. Miguel, Elena said to the ranch foreman, your group will be positioned here, on the south rim of the canyon. You'll have the longest range of fire, but also the most complex field of observation. I need you to track multiple targets and coordinate with Bill's group on the north rim. Miguel Santos nodded seriously. Si, senora, we understand. But what if they try to climb the canyon walls to get at us? Elena showed him a section of her father's journal that detailed similar tactical situations. They won't. Caulfield's men are disciplined, but they're not desperate. They'll probe for weaknesses, but they won't attempt costly frontal assaults on prepared positions unless they have no other choice. She paused. Our job is to make sure they always have another choice, one that leads them deeper into our trap. Bill. Tucker approached with a question about ammunition distribution. Elena had anticipated this concern, producing cases of cartridges that Thomas hadn't known she possessed. Where did all this come from? Thomas asked. My father's emergency supplies, stored in caves throughout these mountains. Elena's expression was matter of fact. He believed in being prepared for situations exactly like this one. There are weapons caches, ammunition stores, and medical supplies hidden in a dozen different locations. Thomas stared at his wife, realizing that her knowledge of the mountains extended far beyond what he'd imagined. Elena, how much did your father prepare for this kind of confrontation? Elena opened the journal to a page titled Defense of Central Valley, Contingency Plans, and showed Thomas detailed maps, supply lists, and tactical scenarios that covered dozens of possible situations. He spent 5 years developing these plans. He said that someday someone would need to defend this valley against organized criminal forces, and when that day came, they would need every advantage that careful preparation could provide. The scope of Marshal Crawford's foresight was staggering. Thomas could see that Elena's father had essentially prepared her to fight this exact battle against this specific enemy, using resources and knowledge that he'd spent years accumulating. Did he know? Thomas asked quietly. Did your father somehow know that Caulfield would eventually come here? Elena was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. He said that men like Caulfield were drawn to places like this valley, prosperous, isolated, and difficult for regular law enforcement to reach. He said it was only a matter of time before someone tried to establish criminal control over the region. She looked directly at Thomas. He was preparing for the inevitable. Doc Peterson approached with his medical supplies organized for battlefield conditions. Mrs. Whitmore, I've set up a treatment station in the canyon where wounded men can be brought without exposing them to continued fire. But I have to ask, how confident are you that this plan will work? Elena considered the question carefully. Doc, my father used similar tactics against criminal organizations 3 times during his career. Each time, the superior tactical position and knowledge of terrain allowed a smaller defending force to defeat a larger attacking force. She paused. But battles are unpredictable things. Good planning improves your chances, but it doesn't guarantee outcomes. Thomas appreciated Elena's honest assessment. She wasn't promising victory, but she was offering the best possible chance of survival and success. Given the circumstances, that was enough. As the final preparations continued, Elena took Thomas aside for a private conversation. They walked to the edge of the ranch yard, where they could see the mouth of Willow Canyon silhouetted against the starlit sky. "Thomas, I need you to understand something," Elena said softly. "What happens in the next few hours will determine not just our survival, but the future of law and order in this territory. If Caulfield succeeds here, if he establishes control over this valley, it will encourage similar attempts throughout the frontier." Thomas nodded. "I understand the stakes, Elena, but I'm more concerned about you. You're taking enormous personal risks." Elena's hand found his in the darkness. "The risks I'm taking are the same ones my father took for 15 years. The difference is that I have something he never had, a home worth defending and a husband worth coming home to." The simple honesty of her statement touched Thomas more deeply than any dramatic declaration could have. Eleanor wasn't seeking glory or adventure. She was fulfilling a duty that she'd inherited and protecting a life that she'd chosen. "Eleanor, after this is over, after Caulfield is defeated, what then? Will you continue as a federal marshal?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and Thomas could see her considering possibilities she hadn't fully explored. "I don't know, Thomas. The law enforcement authority I'm claiming is temporary, meant for emergency situations. Once federal marshals arrive and normal authority is re-established, I'll return to being simply your wife." "You'll never be simply anything," Thomas said with gentle conviction. "You're remarkable, Elena Crawford Whitmore. Whatever you choose to do with your life, I'll support you completely." Elena squeezed his hand. "Right now, I choose to defend our home and our valley. Everything else can be decided later." A distant sound interrupted their conversation, the rhythmic thudding of many horses moving through the mountains. Elena listened intently, her head cocked like a hunting animal assessing potential threats. "They're coming," she said quietly. "Earlier than I expected, but following the route I predicted." She turned to Thomas. "It's time." As they walked back toward the ranch house, Elena began issuing final orders to the positioned men. Her voice carried clearly in the crisp night air, calm and authoritative. "Remember, no one fires until my signal. Let them enter the canyon completely. Before we reveal our positions, Bill, wait for them to pass your position before opening fire. We want them trapped, not warned." She paused. "Miguel, your group has the responsibility for cutting off their retreat. Don't let anyone escape back up the canyon." Thomas took his position with the reserve force, watching as Elena prepared for what might be the most important battle of her life. The federal marshal's badge glinted on her shirt in the moonlight, a symbol of the authority she carried and the justice she was determined to deliver. In the distance, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. 43 armed men were riding toward what they believed would be an easy victory over unprepared ranchers. Instead, they were riding into a carefully planned trap set by a woman who had inherited both the knowledge and the determination to see justice done. Elena checked her weapons one final time, her movements sure and economical. Then she looked toward the canyon, where her father's tactical genius would finally be put to the ultimate test. "For you, Papa," Thomas heard her whisper, "and for all the innocent people who deserve to live in peace." The battle for the soul of the territory was about to begin. The first rays of dawn were painting the eastern peaks when Caulfield's forces entered Willow Canyon. Elena watched from her concealed position as 43 mounted men moved in 3, distinct columns, their formation precise and their movements coordinated. These were not casual outlaws. They rode with the discipline of soldiers executing a planned military operation. Elena raised her signal mirror, catching the early sunlight and flashing a brief reflection toward the canyon rims where her defenders waited. The signal meant enemy in sight, prepare for contact. She watched as acknowledgement flashes came back from both rim positions, Bill Tucker's group on the north and Miguel Santos's team on the south. Benjamin Caulfield rode at the head of the center column, a tall man with graying hair and the erect posture of a career military officer. Even at a distance, Elena could see the confidence in his bearing, the assurance of a man who had never encountered serious resistance to his plans. He gestured to his lieutenants as they entered the canyon, pointing toward the ranch buildings, visible in the distance. Elena felt a cold satisfaction as she watched the raiders move deeper into the trap. Her father's tactical analysis had been perfect. Caulfield was following exactly the approach route that Marshal Crawford had predicted in his journal. The three columns were positioning themselves for a coordinated assault on the ranch buildings, completely unaware that their intended victims were positioned above them, with clear fields of fire. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural funnel that compressed Caulfield's force into a narrow corridor. Elena had chosen this killing ground specifically because it negated the raiders' numerical advantage while maximizing the effectiveness of her defenders' superior position. As the last of Caulfield's men entered the canyon, Elena raised her signal. Mirror again, this time flashing the sequence that meant commence firing. The response was immediate and devastating. Rifle fire erupted from both rim positions simultaneously, the sharp cracks echoing off the canyon walls and creating a thunderous cacophony that spooked the raiders' horses and sent several men tumbling from their saddles. Elena had positioned her best marksman with clear instructions. Aim for the horses first to dismount the raiders, then target any man who tried to establish organized resistance. The psychological effect of the ambush was as important as the physical damage. Caulfield's disciplined columns dissolved into chaos as mounted men found themselves trapped in a narrow canyon with enemy fire coming from elevated positions on both sides. Horses reared and bolted, carrying their riders away from the planned formation and making coordinated response impossible. Elena watched through her field glasses as Caulfield tried to regain control of his forces. The man was clearly a competent military leader. He was shouting orders, trying to establish return fire toward the rim positions and attempting to organize a fighting withdrawal. But the tactical situation was hopeless, and Elena could see that he was beginning to realize it. "Take cover behind the rocks," Caulfield's voice carried clearly in the canyon air. "Establish firing positions and return fire." Some of his men managed to follow these orders, using the scattered boulders in the canyon floor as protection while they tried to locate their attackers. But the rim positions offered excellent concealment, and Elena's defenders had been carefully positioned to minimize their exposure while maintaining clear fields of fire. Elena signaled for the second phase of the attack, Danny Morrison's reserve. Force, positioned at the canyon mouth, opened fire with devastating effect on any raiders who tried to retreat. The trap was now complete. Caulfield's men were caught in a crossfire with no escape route and no effective way to strike back at their attackers. The battle raged for 20 minutes, the sound of gunfire echoing through the mountains and sending wildlife fleeing in all directions. Elena moved carefully among the rocks, using her knowledge of the terrain to observe the fighting from multiple angles while remaining concealed from enemy fire. She could see that Caulfield's force was being systematically destroyed. Nearly half his men were down, either killed or wounded, and the survivors were running low on ammunition. More importantly, their morale was breaking under the relentless pressure of fighting an enemy they couldn't see or effectively engage. Elena made her way to a position where she could observe Caulfield directly. The man was wounded. She could see blood on his left arm, but he was still trying to organize his remaining men for what appeared to be a desperate breakout attempt. This was the moment Elena had been waiting for. She raised her rifle, took careful aim, and fired a single shot that struck the rock inches from Caulfield's head. The message was clear. She could have killed him, but chose not to. Benjamin Caulfield. Elena's voice rang out across the canyon, amplified by the natural acoustics of the rock walls. "I am Federal Marshal Elena Crawford. You and your men are under arrest for murder, treason, and crimes against the territorial government." The gunfire gradually ceased as both sides absorbed this unexpected development. Elena could see Caulfield looking around frantically, trying to locate the source of the authoritative female voice that had just claimed federal law enforcement. "Authority, you have one chance to surrender peacefully," Elena continued. "Throw down your weapons and order your men to do the same. Anyone who continues to resist will be shot." Caulfield's response was exactly what Elena expected from a man of his arrogance and military background. "I don't surrender to women or mountain trash. Men, prepare for final assault," Elena sighed, recognizing the tragic inevitability of what came next. Some men could not be reasoned with, could not be deterred by superior force, and could not accept defeat even when it was obvious. Caulfield was such a man, and his pride would now cost him everything. She raised her signal mirror, one final time, flashing the sequence that meant finish them. The response from her defenders was immediate and merciless. Concentrated rifle fire from all positions swept the canyon floor, targeting anyone who remained armed and resistant. When the smoke cleared 5 minutes later, Benjamin Caulfield's criminal organization had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Elena made her way down into the canyon, her rifle ready but her movements careful and deliberate. The battle was over, but wounded men could still be dangerous, and she had learned from her father never to assume complete victory until every threat had been neutralized. The scene in the canyon was grim, but necessary. Bodies of Caulfields. Men lay scattered among the rocks, their criminal careers ended by the superior tactics and marksmanship of Elena's defenders. She moved among them methodically, checking for survivors who might require medical attention or who might pose continued threats. Benjamin Caulfield himself lay propped against a boulder, clutching a serious wound in his chest, but still alive. His eyes tracked Elena's approach with the mixture of pain and fury that she recognized in men who had never before faced decisive defeat. "Federal Marshal Elena Crawford," Caulfield said, his voice weak but filled with bitter amusement. "I should have known. Your father was James Crawford, wasn't he? The marshal who made my life difficult for so many years." Elena stopped just outside of arm's reach, her rifle trained on Caulfield, but her expression calm. "My father was indeed Marshal James Crawford. And yes, he tracked you and your organization for years. He would have brought you to justice eventually. But he's dead, and you're just a woman playing dress-up with his badge." Caulfield's attempt at mockery was undermined by the blood he coughed up mid-sentence. "You may have won this battle, but you don't have the authority to arrest me. Female federal marshals don't exist." Elena reached into her shirt and pulled out the official document that Marshal Bradley had confirmed earlier, a territorial statute that provided for emergency law enforcement authority in frontier situations. She held it where Caulfield could see the official seals and signatures. Under territorial law, in the absence of appointed federal authority and in the face of immediate threat to civilian populations, immediate family members of federal marshals can assume temporary law enforcement powers. Elena's voice was steady and professional. "Benjamin Caulfield, I am placing you under arrest for murder, treason, conspiracy against the territorial government, and numerous other federal crimes." Caulfield laughed, a harsh sound that turned into another coughing fit. "Arrest me? Look around, Marshal Crawford. Your arrest has turned into a massacre. Every man here is dead or dying. What kind of law enforcement is that?" Eleanor felt the weight of the carnage around her, but her resolve remained firm. The kind that becomes necessary when criminals refuse to surrender peacefully. You were offered the chance to give up. You chose to fight, and I'd choose it again. Caulfield's eyes held no regret, no recognition of the pain and death he had caused throughout the territory. You may have stopped me, but there are others. Men like me don't just disappear because one little girl with a badge gets lucky. Eleanor pulled out a set of shackles from her belt, another item her father had taught her to carry. Maybe not, but you won't be leading them anymore. As she moved to secure Caulfield's hands, the wounded man made one last desperate play for freedom. His right hand darted toward a concealed pistol, but Elena had been watching for exactly such a move. Her father's training had emphasized that wounded enemies were often the most dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. Elena's response was swift and decisive. Her rifle butt struck Caulfield's wrist with enough force to break bones and send his hidden weapon spinning away among the rocks. Caulfield screamed in pain and fury, but the fight went out of him as he realized that he was completely at Elena's mercy. That was unwise, Elena said quietly as she secured the shackles around Caulfield's wrists, but consistent with the poor judgment you've shown throughout your criminal career. With Caulfield secured, Elena turned her attention to checking the other casualties. She found 3 of his men still alive, but wounded too seriously to pose any threat. Doc Peterson arrived with several of the ranch hands to provide medical treatment and secure any surviving prisoners. Marshal Crawford, Doc Peterson said as he began treating the wounded prisoners. Your plan worked exactly as you predicted. The men are calling it the most complete victory they've ever seen. Elena felt no satisfaction in the praise. Victory in battle was never something to celebrate, even when it was necessary and justified. Too many men lay dead in the canyon, and while they had chosen their criminal path willingly, their deaths still represented human lives lost to violence. How are our casualties? Elena asked. Remarkably light. 2 men with minor wounds from ricochets, and Bill Tucker has a graze on his arm from a lucky shot. Nothing serious. Doc Peterson paused in his work. Marshal, your tactical planning saved a lot of good men's lives today. Thomas appeared at Elena's side, his face showing relief and pride in equal measure. Elena, it's over. You did it. Caulfield's organization is finished. Elena looked around the canyon one more time, taking in the evidence of the battle and the price of victory. This part is finished, Thomas, but there's still work to be done. Caulfield needs to be transported to the territorial capital for trial. His surviving men need to be processed through the legal system, and we need to ensure that other criminal organizations understand what happens when they threaten innocent people. Marshal Bradley and Deputy Quinn arrived with several federal agents who had been riding hard through the night to reach the valley. They surveyed the scene with professional appreciation for the tactical skill that had achieved such a decisive result. Marshal Crawford, Bradley said formally, on behalf of the federal government, I want to express our gratitude for your service. Your actions today have prevented what could have been a much larger and more destructive conflict. Elena accepted the praise with quiet dignity, but Thomas could see that her thoughts were already turning toward the future. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the underlying problems that allowed men like Caulfield to operate remained. Marshal Bradley, Elena said, I want to ensure that my father's records and research are made available to federal law enforcement. His knowledge of criminal organizations in frontier territories could prevent similar situations from developing elsewhere. That would be invaluable, Bradley agreed. And Marshal Crawford, I hope you'll consider making your appointment permanent. The territory needs law enforcement officers with your skills and dedication. Elena was quiet for a moment, and Thomas could see her considering possibilities that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of careful thought. I'll consider it, Marshal Bradley. But right Now I want to get Benjamin Caulfield to trial and see justice done for all the innocent people he's harmed." As the federal agents took custody of Caulfield and the surviving prisoners, Elena stood with Thomas at the mouth of Willow Canyon. The morning sun was now fully up, painting the mountains in shades of gold and casting long shadows across the valley floor. "It's really over," Thomas said quietly. Elena nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. "This part is over. But Thomas, what we accomplished here today, it's going to change things. People throughout the territory will know that criminal organizations can be defeated, that law and order can be maintained even in the most remote areas." Thomas looked at his wife, seeing her not just as the woman he loved, but as the federal marshal who had brought justice to their valley. "And what about us? What about our life together?" Elena smiled, and for the first time that morning, Thomas saw the gentle woman he had married rather than the iron-willed law enforcement officer she had become. "Our life together is just beginning, Thomas. Whatever I decide about continuing. As a marshal, whatever challenges we face in the future, we'll face them together." She unpinned her father's badge from her shirt and held it up to catch the morning light. The silver star gleamed with the promise of justice served and the hope of peace maintained. "For now," Elena said softly, "it's enough to know that this valley is safe and that the people we care about can build their lives without fear." In the distance, a church bell began tolling in Cedar Ridge, calling the community to give thanks for their deliverance and to begin the work of healing and rebuilding. The sound carried across the valley like a promise that civilization and decency had triumphed over chaos and violence. The battle was won, but the real victory lay in what would be built in the peace that followed. 6 months after the Battle of Willow Canyon, Elena stood on the steps of the Cedar Ridge Town Hall, watching as Mayor Harrison unveiled a bronze plaque commemorating the defeat of Benjamin Caulfield's criminal organization. The inscription read simply, "In honor of those who stood against lawlessness and preserved the peace of this valley. Their courage made our freedom possible." Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her waist, as the gathered townspeople applauded the memorial. Elena wore the simple blue dress she'd favored before becoming a federal marshal, but the silver star, pinned to her coat lapel, marked her new role as the first appointed female deputy U.S. Marshal in the territory. Marshal Whitmore, Mayor Harrison corrected himself with a slightly embarrassed smile. "Would you like to say a few words?" Elena stepped forward, looking out at the faces of people who had once viewed her with suspicion and uncertainty. Now their expressions showed respect, gratitude, and something approaching awe. The battle had transformed not just Elena's standing in the community, but the community's understanding of what strength and courage could look like. 6 months ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "This valley faced a threat that could have destroyed everything you've worked to build. Criminal forces wanted to take control of your land, your livelihoods, and your freedom." She paused. "You chose to resist. You chose to fight for what was right, even when the outcome was uncertain." Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife who had once dismissed Elena as unsuitable for civilized society, stepped forward from the crowd. "Marshal Whitmore, I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you without understanding who you really were or what you were capable of." Elena's expression was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Pemberton, you don't owe me an apology. You owed me a chance to prove my worth, and eventually you gave me that chance. That's all anyone can ask for." The crowd murmured its approval of Elena's gracious response. Thomas felt a surge of pride as he watched his wife handle the praise and attention with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else in her life. Sheriff Daniels approached the platform, carrying an official-looking document. "Marshal Whitmore, I have something for you from the territorial governor." He handed her a formal charter. "The town of Cedar Ridge is officially requesting that you establish a federal law enforcement office here to serve the entire mountain region. Elena read the document carefully, her expression thoughtful. The charter would give her broad authority to maintain federal law throughout an area covering thousands of square miles, making her responsible for protecting dozens of communities from the kind of criminal organizations that had threatened their valley. "This is a significant responsibility," Elena said finally. "Are you certain that Cedar Ridge wants a permanent federal law enforcement presence?" "Marshal," Mayor Harrison replied, "after what happened with Caulfield, every town in the territory wants to know that there's someone with your skills and dedication watching over the region. We're honored that you'd consider making Cedar Ridge your base of operations." Eleanor looked at Thomas, seeking his opinion on this major decision. Thomas nodded slightly, indicating his support for whatever choice she made. They had discussed the possibility extensively, and he understood both the importance of the work and Elena's sense of duty to continue her father's legacy. "I accept," Elena said simply, "but I want it understood that this office will serve all the people of the region, regardless of their social standing or financial circumstances. The law protects everyone equally." The crowd erupted in applause, but Elena raised her hand for quiet. "There's something else you should know. Federal authorities have confirmed that Benjamin Caulfield's trial resulted in a conviction on all charges. He'll spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and the territorial government has implemented new policies to prevent the kind of corruption that allowed his organization to operate for so long." Doc Peterson stepped forward, his weathered face creased with satisfaction. "Marshal, what about the other criminal groups that might be operating in frontier territories? How do we prevent similar threats from developing?" Elena had anticipated this question, and her answer reflected months of careful planning with federal authorities. "We are establishing a network of law enforcement offices throughout the frontier territories, with regular communication and coordination between them. Criminal organizations thrive in isolation, but they can't operate effectively when there's organized law enforcement working together across territorial boundaries." Maria Santos approached with her 3 children, the same family Elena had comforted on the morning of the evacuation. The oldest boy, now 8, looked up at Elena with obvious hero worship. "Marshal Whitmore," the boy said seriously, "when I grow up, I want to be a lawman like you and protect people from bad men." Elena knelt down to the boy's level, her expression warm and encouraging. "That's a noble goal, young man. But remember, the badge doesn't make you a protector. The willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous, that's what makes you a protector. And that's something you can do regardless of what job you choose." Thomas watched this interaction with deep affection and admiration. Elena's ability to inspire others, especially young people, was one of her most remarkable qualities. She represented not just law enforcement, but the possibility that anyone could make a difference if they had the courage to try. As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor and Thomas walked slowly back toward their ranch. The familiar landscape looked the same as it had a year ago, but everything had changed. The valley was safer, the community was stronger, and Elena had found her true calling as a protector of justice in frontier territory. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked as they reached their front porch. Elena considered the question carefully. "About the violence? Yes, always. Violence should be the last resort, even when it's necessary. But regrets about the choice to fight for what's right? No, none at all." She pulled out her father's journal, which had become her constant companion during the months of establishing her new law enforcement office. "My father spent his life trying to bring justice to frontier territory. Now, I have the chance to continue that work, to build on what he started." Thomas settled beside her on the porch steps, looking out at the mountains that had shaped both their lives. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished, Elena. You've honored his memory and his dedication to justice." Elena leaned against Thomas's shoulder, finding comfort in his steady presence. The work isn't finished, Thomas. There are still communities throughout the territory that need protection, still criminal organizations that prey on innocent people. But now we have the tools and the authority to fight them effectively. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from a mountain woman dismissed by polite society to a federal marshal respected throughout the territory. The transformation hadn't changed who she was at her core. It had simply revealed the strength and courage that had always been there. "Thomas," Elena said quietly, "do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if Caulfield had never come to this valley? If we'd just continued as rancher and wife, living quietly without any of this drama and danger?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering the alternative life they might have had. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But Elena, I think we both would. I've always wondered what we were capable of, what we might have accomplished if we'd been tested." He squeezed her hand gently. "Now we know, and I'm proud of what we discovered about ourselves and about each other." Elena smiled, feeling the deep contentment that came from finding one's true purpose in life. "The people who mocked our marriage, who thought you'd made a mistake by choosing a rough mountain woman, what do they think now?" "They think I'm the luckiest man in the territory," Thomas replied with genuine warmth. "And they're right." As darkness settled over the valley, Elena and Thomas remained on their porch, planning for the future and savoring the peace they had fought to preserve. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled like stars, each one representing a family that could sleep safely because justice had prevailed over lawlessness. Elena's father's badge caught the lamplight from their windows, a symbol of duty fulfilled and legacy continued. The mountain woman who had once been dismissed as unsuitable for civilized society had become the guardian of civilization itself, proving that true worth could never be measured by social expectations or superficial judgments. The story of Elena. Crawford Whitmore was far from over, but this chapter had ended exactly as it should, with justice served, love strengthened, and the promise of a better future secured for all who called the valley home.